Now that we've got used to some of the terminology within Docker and some of the commands used in order to get you started with creation of images and containers themselves, we're now going to progress into more of the automation side of things. How can you build your own custom images, and from these images create your own containers? And one way we can do that is with a Dockerfile. Now, what is a Dockerfile? Essentially, it's just a text file with a series of instructions. And these instructions are essentially commands which tell Docker what you want to do in order to create this image. So you could have something like you want a SQL server on Linux, you want to copy in a series of database backup files, SQL Server backup files, and have some scripts that will automate the restore of those backup files. So when you spin up your container, everything is done for you. It's just there. You know, you saw before in some of the demos that we had to spin up a container, we had to manually copy the files in, we had to spin up Management Studio, and we had to run restore scripts. With a Docker file, you wouldn't necessarily have to do that. We can contain that all within this one file. So what exactly does it look like? So here is an example Docker file, and if we just sort of quickly step through what exactly it is doing, just to give you an idea as to how this all works. So with your first line, what we're essentially doing here is telling Docker what image we want, what base OS image we want to use for the purposes of this new image we're going to create. And in this case, we're going to use SQL Server on Linux 2017, generally available one. And once we've got that, what we're going to do is the next step is we're going to create a new directory within that container. Again, just in the user source SQL script, we're going to set that as a working directory. And then what we want to do is we want to copy the contents of a folder from the host, a folder called shell, into that newly created directory in the container. And once we've got that, we need to apply the relevant permissions in order for an additional shell script to be run, which will allow us to restore the database, appropriately named restore dbs.sh. And at the very end here, we've got a command basically telling the container, once it's done all those steps, I want to run a bash terminal just to keep the container running, because in previous demos I explained about the pt1, which if we don't have something running at the end of the creation of a container, it will just do what it needs to do and then just shut down, which is not what we want to do. We want to make this available for everybody to use. So we're running bash terminal, and we're going to run another shell script called entry point. So if we have a look at the restore dbs shell script, just to see what exactly we're passing in here as an instruction. Now, what I've done with this script is I've put a sleep command of 15 seconds. And the reason why I've done that is in certainly the early days when playing around with these SQL Server on Linux images, they took a little while to actually spin up. You know, you do a Docker run and it would say everything's all right. You try and connect and you would just get errors saying can't connect. So when I progressed into creating Docker files, I was doing a similar process to what we've got here, copying files, trying to restore databases, and I was getting a lot of error messages. And the reason for that was that when it was trying to run the restore database script, the SQL Server itself it hadn't fully loaded, it hadn't spun up fully. It was still going through its startup processes. So I've put this little sleep command in there just to give it a bit of time to wake up, do what it needs to do in order for us to then start running scripts against it. And what we've got next is we're going to run a SQL command, connecting to the local host, SA, password, and we're going to run a restore AdventureWorks Linux.sql script. Nothing complex, very simple. Now, at the bottom of the Docker file, I mentioned about this entry point, and what that shell script is ultimately going to do is that is going to keep SQL Server running by running essentially the inverted commas executable within Linux itself. It's then going to run the restore databases shell script, and then we're going to run a bash shell script. And all the bash shell script does is it just runs a bash terminal, and that's what keeps things running at the end. So the entry point is saying start SQL Server, restore the databases, run a bash command. Very, very simple. So how do we go about creating an image from a Docker file? So what we have here is a relatively quick demo whereby we will use the Docker file that we've just seen, and we will create an image called SQL Linux dockerfile restore AW. Probably not the best name in the world, but it kind of tells you exactly what we're doing. And then from that, we're going to create a SQL Linux restore AW container, and hopefully that will show us a container with AdventureWorks already restored just by doing a Docker run against the image that we've just created. So I'm just setting a couple of variables here, and just want to make sure that we've removed the image that we're going to create. Nothing's running in the background, cause us a problem. So how do we actually create this image? We have this command called docker build, and with the build command, all we're going to do is pass in what we want to call this image, and very simply at the end here, a full stop. And the reason for the full stop, what that does is it just tells Docker to look within the folder that we're running this from, the context of where we are, just look for a file called dockerfile, and it doesn't have any extension, it's just dockerfile. You can tell it to look in different folders, but for the purposes of this, we're just going to use the full stop, and it will run that file. So let's see what happens. And we can see here what it's doing is it's sending the requests essentially to the Docker daemon itself, what it needs to do. And we will see a series of steps that's running here. We've got 1 of 6, 2 of 6, 3 of 6, 4. Now, and this is everything that we've got in our Docker file, right the way down to the bottom here, where we've got the command running the bash terminal, passing in the entry point shell script. One thing to note with this, each of these steps you will see here, it's, the line above, it's running in, and then it's giving it a container name. So every single instruction that you have in a Docker file, what it will do is it will create a little container to do what it needs to do, and then blow it away as soon as it's done that step, and kind of create the building blocks in order to get you your final image at the end. So you can see here it's running in there, in that container, that container ID, and then straight away afterwards it's removing the intermediate container CD at 9. And you'll see that for all the steps as we work down. And hopefully, if everything's worked well, you get successfully built, and that will be our new image name. And we can have a look at that just to make sure that we do have the image, and we have SQL Linux dockerfile restore AW, and that's the one that we were creating from the Docker file, created about a minute ago. So fantastic. Now that we've got that, we can start creating containers from it. Now again, Docker run, we've seen this a million times so far, and the only difference being we're actually passing in the image name of the image that we've just created with the database restored. So if we run that, we will see that, yeah, it's essentially created the container, and in the background it'll be doing all its startup, including the likes of the copying all the files from the shell folder, the restore database scripts, etc., ready to, once it's done all that, to run restore script at the end. So hopefully if we time this right, yeah, we can see certain things are working here. So we've got the likes of the temp DBs being created, so we should be in a good position to actually have a go at